All right, so let's get to it here. We're dealing with this situation here. I think the first thing you want to do is look at the information provided. And you can see here that we do not have a binding price ceiling or floor. So the federal funds rate is basically freely motionless or freely motioning between the ceiling and the floor. So basically it looks like this. Quantity loanable funds, federal funds rate. Got our discount rate up here at 3.5%. We've got our interest on reserves down here at 1.25%. And this is roughly what our graph looks like. Okay, so we're at the equilibrium here. So the Fed is not borrowing, or excuse me, the banks are not borrowing any money from the Fed. They're not using this discount rate, okay? They're not saving any excess reserves here. They're only going to be holding their interest on reserves. They'll only be holding their required reserve with this 1.25% interest on reserves, okay? So getting back to the original question here, if the Fed engages in open market purchases, all right, turns out this is not going to be very important for this particular question, but we need to think about how that would affect mortgages, okay? In the case of a mortgage, the bank is the saver. So if a bank right now wants to save, it could save money at the Fed at 1.25%. It could save money at the other banks, the federal funds market, and get 1.95%. So in regards to its excess reserves, if it's going to be saving any money, it is going to choose the 1.95% rate. All right, that's for its excess reserves. So what that means is if it can save effectively risk-free at 1.95%, it's going to be charging you more than 1.95%, okay? Now, getting back to this question at hand, we do need to actually have this graph because we need to think about what would happen to the federal funds rate, okay? I guess you could draw the graph. You don't really have to. The bottom line is we're going to see that the federal funds rate is going to drop. More money decreases the federal funds rate. So the savings curve would shift right because there's more money. The borrowing curve would shift left because there's a greater or a lowered need to borrow. And that would drive down the federal funds rate, okay? And since the federal funds rate drops, all other freely moving rates would drop with it, okay? So if this thing drops down to 1.4%, for example, now banks can risk-free make loans at 1.4%. So since there's a 0.5% difference in terms of what they get in the federal funds rate, there's probably going to be close to a 0.5% difference in terms of what would happen to mortgages as well. All right, question 2 here. All right, unemployment rate is 7.5%. If the Fed lowers the discount rate, what will this do? Okay. So in this case, this is going to create a binding price ceiling. When they drop that discount rate to 1.75% here, now the discount rate is below the federal funds rate. All right. That's going to do a couple of different things. One, it's going to immediately create money because when banks borrow right now at this moment, they're going to be borrowing money from the Fed. So that'll increase the money supply. And then the second thing that'll happen is banks will be forced to drop the federal funds rate to be competitive, probably to 1.75%, maybe a little bit below that, okay? So now we've got more money. So the money supply goes up. So the question is, how will this affect the economy? All right, first of all, this stimulates the economy. It stimulates the economy because there's more money. And when there's more money, that means lower interest rates. That means asset prices go up. That means people expect the economy to get better. So the economy will be stronger, okay? And this effect will be bigger if prices are sticky, okay? The reason for that is if the money supply goes up, but prices stay the same, that will basically feel like a demand increase. Think about being an individual business in this economy. If everybody has more money, but you keep prices exactly the same, you're going to earn more revenues than you did before because of the extra demand. All the consumers have more money, so they're going to buy more of your goods. So you're going to be selling goods more readily, okay? Since you're going to see that demand increase, you're also going to reduce unemployment rates. All right, you're going to hire more workers, leading to a lower unemployment rate for society. So this will stimulate the economy, and the effect would be bigger if it was sticky. If instead it's flexible, well, businesses would just raise their prices really quickly, and it wouldn't really do much. All right, looking at this information here, this is an easier one. What interest rate would I expect to receive on savings? Well, the federal funds rate is 1.95%. If I open a savings account, banks are never going to give me more than that. So the savings account I earn will be equal to or less than 1.95%. Question 4. All right, same information here. If the Fed raises the reserve rate, what will this do to the federal funds rate? All right, well, when the reserve rate moves up, that makes the money supply go down. And since the federal funds rate is freely moving right now, the federal funds rate will go up. Question 5. The Fed engages in open market sales and destroys the money. All right, so obviously that's going to push the money supply go down. And in general, that would push the federal funds rate up. Okay, so for this particular question, this is a tricky one, and certainly it helps to draw the graph. So again, this is what it looks like. Okay, so that's our starting point there with that 1.95% federal funds rate. Okay, so this is going to destroy money, all right? Anytime money gets destroyed, that reduces the amount of savings and increases the amount of borrowing. So perhaps savings shifts like that, borrowing shifts like that, and we're left with a higher federal funds rate, okay? However, that's not the only possibility, okay? In this case that I drew, we still have an equilibrium. We don't have a binding price ceiling, so banks would not be borrowing from the Fed. But another possibility is it could simply just shift further than that. All right, so if savings were to shift up to S3, borrowing were to shift over to B3, okay, it's kind of hard to see, but now we would be left with a shortage. And that extra borrowing that needs to happen would happen from the Fed, okay? So since we don't know how big these effects are, all we can say is it could possibly cause banks to borrow from the Fed. It will definitely increase federal funds rate. We're just not sure if it would go so far as to create a binding price ceiling. Okay, question 6 here. If the Fed engages in open market sales and destroys the money, what would happen? So, actually, if we just look back to this graph here, we don't actually know what would happen. It depends on which effect is bigger, okay? So when we think about the borrowing curve shifting right, that tends to increase the quantity of loanable funds. When we think about the savers curve shifting left here, that tends to decrease the quantity of loanable funds. And since we do not know which of these shifts is bigger, we don't know what's going to happen to the quantity of federal funds exchanged in this market. All right, so as a basic rule of thumb, anytime you've got supply and demand for any type of good or service or whatever, you can always only tell what's going to happen to one of these variables when supply and demand both shift, okay? So for example, if supply moves to the right and demand moves to the right, we would reach a new equilibrium at B here, okay? Certainly the quantity would go up because supply and demand are both shifting right. They're both shifting towards a higher quantity. But in terms of the price, demand is sort of shifting up, supply is kind of shifting down, so you've got opposing effects there, so we don't know what's going to happen to price. If this is unclear to you, please let me know, and I can try to discuss this in office hours or something. This is something you 100% should have seen in microeconomics. All right, so question 7, this is where we get a new batch of information here, so we need to review this real quick. And what we have here is a binding price floor, okay? So it looks something like this. So that's my interest on reserves. Here's my discount rate. And so in this case, our situation looks something like that. So at this moment here, okay, at this moment here, the quantity saved is greater than the quantity borrowed. So there's excess money saved, and that excess money would be saved at the Fed. So if you kind of imagine a random bank, that random bank is holding, of course, its required reserves at the Fed, saving some money at the federal funds market, and then also saving some excess reserves at the Fed, okay? So that may not be relevant to this question, but we certainly need to be prepared to draw these. So getting back to the question, which of the following best describes the interest rate I will pay if I take out a private student loan in this economy? Okay, so if the federal funds rate is 3.75%, that means banks can lend at 3.75%. They could also lend to the Fed at 3.75%. So if I get a loan, I'm going to pay more than that, all right? The reason I'll pay more is because I'm risky, and also usually the person who's borrowing the money has control over that money in terms of how quickly they pay it back. There's a liquidity preference there. So I'm going to pay greater than 3.75% if I'm borrowing money. All right, same information here. If the Fed engages in open market purchases, what will that do to the federal funds rate? Okay, so the money supply goes up, the federal funds rate goes down, but in this case, we are at the binding price floor. So it can't go down any further. So instead, we would get no change in the federal funds rate. Looking back at our original graph here, the way this would look is when they engage in open market purchases, the savers curve would shift right, the borrowing curve would shift left, and so you would end up with an even bigger surplus. Okay? So the federal funds rate would stay the same. All right, Fed raises the required reserve rate to 6.75%. Okay? So in this case, when the required reserve rate goes up, the money supply goes down, and normally that would push the federal funds rate up. But for this question here, it's again one of those very, very tricky ones where we can't actually tell what's going to happen. Okay, so here's our starting point here, something like that. Okay, and so what's going to happen is when the money supply decreases, there's going to be less money saved and more money borrowed. So you could get a shift like that. And as you can kind of tell there, with that shift, we still have a binding price floor, and the federal funds rate remained at 3.75%. However, if those shifts were just a little bit bigger, we would reach equilibrium, okay? So we could shift all the way to S3, could shift all the way to B3, and now we reach equilibrium. We don't have a binding price floor. So the bottom line is we don't know for sure. We have some idea because we know it can't drop. So the bottom line is the answer to this one is D. This would increase the federal funds rate or result in no change. Question 10. The Fed raises the discount rate to 6%. That's going to do absolutely nothing. The discount rate is already non-binding. So if you change the discount rate and it remains non-binding, you've done nothing. So that will have no effect. Raises the ceiling without having any effect. Fed raises the interest rates on reserves. How will that affect the quantity of money borrowed in the federal funds market? Okay, this was another particularly difficult question. If you're not drawing these, it certainly makes things a lot harder. So let's draw our starting point. Looks something like that. And we got to make sure we understand quantity and how quantity works down here, okay? So if I ask you right now how much money is being exchanged in the federal funds market, the answer is actually this amount, this QB amount, all right? So if I put some values in here, imagine this, okay? In this market right now, the savers would like to save $10 billion. The borrowers are willing to borrow $6 billion. So the amount of money that actually gets exchanged in the federal funds market would be $6 billion, okay? because the $4 billion in between here is not exchanged in the market. That money leaves the market and gets held at the Fed, okay? So since the quantity of borrowing here is lower, it is basically going to determine how much money is exchanged in the market. So to get to our question now, if they raise the interest rate on reserves to 4.25%, what that does is it increases the amount that they would like to save, and it decreases the amount that the banks would like to borrow. And again, the quantity borrowed is going to be what determines how much money is exchanged. So maybe this is 4 and this is 12, okay? Even though they want to save $12 billion, banks are only willing to borrow $4 billion. So $4 billion will be the amount exchanged in this market. So the quantity is going to decrease. It's a hard one. Okay, question 12, all right? Students sometimes get scared when there's a bunch of different answers here. Don't let that freak you out. Answer the question and then look and see what your options are. So consider federal funds market with a 5.5% discount rate, 1% rate for interest on reserves, 5.5% federal funds rate. Okay, so what that tells us is we've got a binding price ceiling. So this would look something like this. Okay. So what would happen if the Fed sells $100 billion of assets and destroys money? So the money supply goes down. Well, normally that would push the federal funds rate up, okay? But it can't in this situation because we're at the ceiling. So with less money out there, the borrowing curve would shift right and the savings curve would shift left, right? There's a greater need to borrow, a lesser need to save money. Sorry, make that where you can see it. So what's basically going to happen is we start out with a shortage, and then the shortage gets even bigger after this effect. So to answer the question here, we know the borrower's curve shifts right. We know the saver's curve shifts to the left, and then we just need to make sure we see what happens to the federal funds rate. Federal funds rate is definitely not going to change, right? We're hitting our head on the ceiling here. We're already at the maximum, so we can't go any higher. So the answer here is K. Okay, so this is a written response question. Consider a federal funds market that is operating with a 3.5% discount rate, 3.5% federal funds rate. So we've got a binding ceiling. 1% interest rate on reserves. If the required reserve rate is 10%, will banks hold any money at the Fed? The answer is yes, okay? And I'm not going to write it out here, but here is the bottom line. In this situation, the banks would hold no excess reserves at the Fed, but keep in mind, banks are required to hold money. In this case, they're required to hold 10%, all right? They can hold it at the bank or they can hold it at the Fed. So they're going to choose to hold their required reserves at the Fed. Because if they hold it at the Fed, they get 1%, which is better than holding it in their bank vaults and getting no return. All right, let's think realistically about the Federal Reserve and the tactics it uses. If the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, what would it likely do? As we've seen again and again and again, the federal funds rate is the key element for the Fed. That is what they focus on. So they're going to try to affect the federal funds rate and to decrease the money supply, right? Like the question asks, then the federal funds rate would need to go up. So the Fed is going to focus on increasing the federal funds rate target, okay? And that will be its key policy tool. So when the Fed makes an announcement, they're not going to come out and say, we're going to make open market sales, we're going to, raise the required reserve rate. No, they're going to come out and they're going to say, we're going to target a higher federal funds rate. And then they will set about trying to figure out how to do that. Question 15, suppose that the market for loanable funds always operates at equilibrium. Currently 50 million is exchanged in this market. If I suddenly borrow 5 million, what will happen to the amount exchanged in this market? A little callback to older material here. So there is a generic loanable funds market. Now, this is not the federal funds market, okay? This is just market for borrowing and saving, in this case, in a market that reaches equilibrium. All right, so there's our beginning point there. And that quantity that we start with is the 50 million, okay? So this is a tricky one because you have to really draw the graph to get at the correct answer here. When I save $5 million, what that does is it creates a parallel shift in the borrowing curve of 5 million. All right, that shift right there, all right, throughout that entire graph, that shift right there represents a 5 million unit change, okay? So if we kind of just drew 2 points right there, this would be a $5 million difference. So from where we were to where we are now, there's a $5 million difference. But notice the equilibrium is between those 2 points. So the quantity exchanged here is between 50 and 55 million. So what happened? Well, this is basically what occurs. When I borrow that $5 million, that drives up the interest rate. All right, so when I borrow that $5 million, that drives up the interest rate. So what that does is it causes some people to stop saving or stop borrowing money. So when I say $5 million, there's someone else that was borrowing and they stop borrowing money, okay, because of the higher rate. And so the quantity borrowed goes down, and that's why we get that effect, okay? So in other words, just to reiterate what happens here, I borrow the money, the interest rates go up, and somebody that was borrowing money gets out of that transaction so that they're no longer borrowing money anymore. And that's why we get a smaller increase in the quantity exchange there. All right, market always operates at equilibrium. Will Say's law hold? Yes. All right, if we're always at equilibrium, then Say's law will hold. 17 here. The Fed engages in open market sales and destroys the money. Which of the following would have a bigger effect? All right, well, they're destroying the money, so the money supply is definitely going to go down. The effect is which one would have a bigger reduction in the money supply? And the answer is scenario 2, okay? Here's the reason why. In scenario 2, when the money supply goes down, that federal funds rate there can freely go up. And when the federal funds rate goes up, that alone causes the money supply to drop, okay? So since the federal funds rate can go up, we'll get a second effect. Not only do we get a decreased money supply from the open market sales, but we'll also get a raised federal funds rate, which also decreases the money supply. So we get 2 effects there. On the contrary here, in this case, the federal funds rate cannot go up. It's already at the ceiling. And furthermore, when banks borrow now, they're going to be borrowing more money from the Fed, which increases the money supply. So we're going to get a much smaller decrease in money supplied from scenario 1. And in some extreme cases, maybe even the money supply could go up. If the banks are borrowing a lot more money from the Fed, perhaps I could drive the money supply up, okay? So it is very, very, very likely that this would decrease the money supply because we have open market sales. But the reduction is definitely going to be greater in scenario 2 because of the fact that we're not at the ceiling. All right, consider the Keynesian model of the economy with 4.1% unemployment. I'm trying to throw in a few older questions so we don't forget this material. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So there is our starting point. I know that that's our starting point, okay, because the unemployment rate is 4.5% or less. So the economy is maxed out, okay? So if aggregate demand decreases, what would happen to real GDP? Well, if aggregate demand shifts to 82, real GDP would stay the same. But if aggregate demand were to shift to 83, real GDP would decrease. So real GDP could decrease or stay the same depending on how big the effect is. So, you can kind of imagine the government goes out and raises taxes to try to pay off some debt. Right now we're at 4.1%. People are arguing about what's going to happen in the economy. Well, if we use a little bit of Keynesian analysis, what we will learn is if the government raises taxes in this economy, we actually can't tell what will happen to real GDP. It will either go down or stay the same. In general, when inflation rates increase, people are blank likely to hold money at their homes. All right, so when inflation goes up, that makes holding money more expensive. So that will make people less likely to hold money at their homes. Okay, so that's the first part of this here. Again, because if the inflation rate goes from 2% to 5%, that means that the money is losing value much more quickly when you hold it at home. So you will instead put your money in a bank or buy stocks or buy goods and services. Put your money somewhere where it has the chance to either grow or get spent. So when the inflation rate goes up, the money multiplier will become stronger. All right, so the answer is B. All right, the reason the money multiplier becomes stronger is when the inflation rate goes up, that causes people to take their money out of storage, stop hoarding money, and instead get it into the economy so it has a chance to grow, right? Money goes from people's homes, perhaps into banks, and thus you get a bigger money multiplier. So this is kind of an interesting effect because what this tells you is when inflation goes up, the money multiplier goes up, which causes inflation to go up. So once inflation starts to rise, it tends to keep moving in that direction. And the very last one here. Suppose the money supply is measured by M2 is currently 18.4 trillion. Current GDP is 32.3 trillion. So we're trying to figure out what exactly is the velocity of money. There's the formula we need. All right, this formula is very intuitive. What this is saying is if the money supply is 3, for example, or let's say 3 trillion, for example, and the velocity is 6, well, then that means there's $3 trillion. Each dollar is spent 6 times a year, so we would have $18 trillion spent. All right, that's the logic to that formula. So getting to our specific question here, we know the money supply is 18.4 trillion. Don't know the velocity. We know the current GDP is 32.3 trillion. So we can just do some very simple math here to solve for velocity. And in this case, it's about 1.76, okay? Be careful here. I had a few people put 1.76 trillion, which it seems like you've gotten a pretty decent answer there, but in reality, 1.76 trillion is very, very wrong. That means that the average dollar would be spent 1.76 trillion times a year, okay? This answer is not a dollar amount, and it's not in trillions. What it's telling you here is the average dollar, as measured by M2, is spent 1.76 times per year, not trillion. Hopefully that helped, and we'll see you guys soon.